With that, I want to turn it over to Gilda, and I would be happy to do some questions.
Wonderful. I have to put in a good word for your resources. They're wonderful. Your newsletters, they're always so thought-provoking, and this talk as well. I love what you talked about today, about the challenges of today have really made us hyper-focus on this very narrow definition of success and what we've done to our children. It really, with our best of intentions to maximize their success, we have done the opposite, that we need to pull back. Tell me how I'm doing here. You need to
Yeah.
pull back and think big picture. Is it that grade? Is it that club? Is it that line on the resume? Or is it this focusing on the skills for a lifetime, the executive function skills? We can really prepare them. And so I love what you talked about, the friendships, and I want to get into that in a minute, the importance of that at a time when it's so difficult for children. It's even more important, isn't it? This idea of building connections with others for the skills of a lifetime. So will you talk about that again? Just reiterate why that connection is so critical.
So, one of the things we find is that because there's such a hyper focus on achievements and college admission and just external validation in general, that kids are often drawn to what they don't even realize is transactional friendships. Like, what can I get from this person or what can they do for me? And what that ends up doing is it decreases our time and energy to spend on authentic connections with supporters, people who are supportive to us. At some point, most adults realize that competitive friendships aren't really friendships, and it can be exhausting, right? And so, what I want us to think about are what are the skills that kids need to make and maintain friendships? And so, I mentioned a lot of those are based on the executive functions, which are the first pillar of the book, systems, right? So, to be able to have inhibitory control, to be able to have working memory, to be able to be cognitively flexible, those all help us develop connections on a very tangible day to day, to be able to introduce yourself to others, to be able to hold a basic conversation, to be able to feel comfortable being uncomfortable, like being in a new space where you might not know people, and feel that you can make that introductory conversation. What we found in classrooms is that you'll have kids who have sat next to each other for 6 weeks, not one has said a thing to the other. And now suddenly they think, oh, that person doesn't like me. But reality is, neither one of them has started the conversation. And so, one of the things I talked about is how in our work in schools through my nonprofit is that we want to break down those barriers early. And sometimes it involves, again, that idea of time, structure, and support from adults. You have a holiday party coming up, for example. Make sure kids are given a task where they can talk to everybody, or they are in, doing something where they interact with people. Because sometimes being in conversation when you're doing a task feels easier, right? Taking people's jackets, or, making sure they have appetizers, whatever it is, right? So thinking about what are the ways that we can help students build small talk. And then, sitting beside them, for example, as they do it, something, making an introduction for the first time, rather than feeling like, oh, if they can't do it, I should just do it for them, or I can just break the ice.
That's a big takeaway for me. This parallel idea of we're not going to do it for them, but they're going to know that we're in there together, being curious, and then of course always the modeling. But this we really, that is, as I said, an important takeaway for me. We can't just depend that these skills will develop naturally, or they're necessarily it's something taught in school. And so this awareness about executive function, about how the role that we play in our child's life. So there's so much here in what you've talked about. Now, my child comes in the door and I want to have a conversation with them about this new understanding that I have and this new awareness. Help me start that conversation. What do you want to ensure that I say to my child? Some of the important takeaways here.
Well, I think just as important as what you say is how you say it, right? This idea that tone matters is really important. So thinking about it in a way of coming from a place of non-judgment, non-criticism, and asking open-ended questions. So for example, this is a great time to be like, maybe not right now if students are in the middle of finals, depending on where they are, if they have big exams, but
Mhm.
what went really well for you last term, right? Start with that. Always start with a positive. What would you like to do differently this term? And that could be, I had a student last week say, I want to be able to talk to more people, right? That was really genuine. It's like this person struggles with conversations, and that was her thing. And I thought, wow, that's so great. And then if we're at the end of this upcoming term and it went really well, what would that feel like or look like for you? Because that's different for everybody. But what all, those three questions do is you start in the positive, you offer the option for change, right? And then you end with a visualization that's positive, right? So it's that arc of not saying everything's perfect, but really, hey, there are good things happening. Let's focus on that. And then let's also say we want to make some progress on some certain things. And having kids identify for you or for themselves what's important to them again builds that motivation to make the behavioral changes, because when they verbalize it and they connect it to their daily habits and weekly routines, that's when you see change versus saying, oh, I just need to get a 4.0, or oh, I just need to join this thing.
I love what you said about how it's so, for all of us, for our children, for ourselves, really need to get beyond the grade, get beyond the grade. And think again, pulling back big picture for thinking about not just because, as you say, as you talked about so often, what happens when you get to college? Do I have these skills so I can be successful there?
Well, and I'll end with this note is that right now I'm seeing it live, real time in my office. It's like students right now are in classes, and depending on, where they navigated the pandemic and where they were at grade level, where they're coming up against some really hard content that they have to learn, and that takes time and takes repetition, and you can't just do it once. You have to really understand the concepts. And it's been really challenging for them. And it's also challenging for their parents, because part of it is like these subjects are cumulative, right? So you think about a calculus or a physics or a biology that's cumulative. And so August, September, October was tough. November got really, really hairy. And now the child's in December, and you're like, well, but can we just raise the grade? And you want to go back and say, but what were our habits in August, September, October when you said everything was great? And this is not for, again, the grade, because long term, we want kids to learn how to learn. That's one of the chapters in the book. And it's actually the chapter that focuses on the young man who was in the first book and who is in Erasing the Finish Line, about how he learned how to learn, which has taken him not just to the classroom in high school, but to college and now to the workplace. Is that he realized that his own learning process was something that he had to say that it takes these steps, it requires these things.
Sarah, did you have a question you want to ask? We've got about 2 minutes left here. Um, um, Go ahead. And if Sarah doesn't, I've got a question. What's the elevator speech that you want kids to know about this?
Around this work is that that is a really good way of thinking about it. So, Erasing the Finish Line uses these four pillars to highlight the foundational skills that help all people reflect, adapt, and redirect in a world that's so different than the world that many of our adults grew up in. And so, our focus is that we want to give students the tangible tips that make them feel like they have a sense of control, that they are competent to make good choices, and that they can build a community where they feel a sense of belonging throughout their lives.
Beautiful. There are a lot of people here that want you to put up your slide for your resources. Someone commented on your stack of books on the side. Have you read the book How to Decorate with Books? I think you have, because in the
Yeah, let me pull up this. Oh, here we are. There we go. Yeah, well, I am a reader, so I again, I love to read. Yeah, with there. There are a lot of books.
So you know what you've done today. You really let us know about the importance of this. And I'm really happy that as with those slides that I put up about what's coming up, Bruce Perry on the
Yeah,
impact of trauma, his work is so important about how we can't access that part of the brain if we're in trauma. Motivating your child with Ellen Bredin. I know these are all colleagues of yours. So we're just going to, and we need to hear it over and over and over. And I always love hosting you. And I can't wait to see you at 7 o'clock tonight.
well,
So
thanks for having me, and I'll see you then.
see you then. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Take care. And you've got all this information, so many questions about your resource. So I'm glad you put that up. So what do you think as parents make this transition to this pulling back and having this awareness of it's not the grade, it's the skill that's going to make my child be successful forever? What do you think is the hardest thing for parents to grasp?
I think it's honestly getting started. It's a totally different framework of how to think. And I want to make sure that people understand. I'm not saying don't care about grades or like give it all up and just what I am saying is you if you refocus on the underlying skills rather than the grade as the main marker, oftentimes what I've often seen is kids do better than ever expected because again, we've built this foundation. And over time, maybe it doesn't happen in year one, but in year two and year three, I've been doing this now for over 20 years. I'm still in contact with some of my students from 3, 5, 7 years ago. You see that not only does it translate to all of this being built up, but it also allows them to build their confidence to try new things. So I think for parents, it's really a shift in thinking, oftentimes one of the first talks I gave, and it's happened before, one of the slide that says take the B, a parent said, "Could you go back to that slide?" And was like, "Why are you telling me that it's okay to get a B minus?" And I was like, "No, it's all about this idea of backseat and habits and underlying things." Because when you're saying when a child is struggling, let's say, for example, they're in a class that really involves a higher level of information that's really tough for them. Everybody's going to meet that class at some point, right? And when I ask them, "Hey, let's go through the habits. Have you done this and this and this and this?" And I do it in a non-judgmental, non-critical way. They'll say, "Yes, no, yes. Oh, I want to focus on that more." These are habits, right? And so that regains that sense of control. That's have you gone through the old tests? Have you visited your teacher at office hours? Are you doing homework on the night it's assigned? Those are all options that then puts the control and the autonomy back in the seat of the child rather than just saying, "Oh my gosh, if I can calculate." Do you have children who do this? They go on the calculator and they're like, "If I get a 95 on the final, I will get this grade in the class." So we want to it's a shift in conversation. And once parents feel comfortable with it, it's a game changer.
Mhm. When you give a presentation to students, what's one nugget that you want them to walk out the door with?
I want them to really think about evaluating their own sense of systems and what's working for them and what's not.
Mhm.
And when they do that, they're really able to think through, okay, this is how and where I want to spend my time. The other thing I want them to actually walk away with, if I'm thinking about two things, it's their time and energy. So we often talk about time, but you've had other speakers talk about this too, I'm sure, but energy management. So I talk with kids all the time about doing their work when they have the most energy, being able to learn new concepts. What are the things that they need to do to be energized so that they're not trying to force themselves through draining experiences? And that just makes us feel even less confident. So I think those are the two.
Yeah. Um, I want to be sure that everybody knows about the newsletter that you have that is so useful, that's got tons of information. And of course, this book, which is it's all here. So is there one question that comes up again and again when you give this presentation to parents?
I think the main thing that people are wondering about is what you brought up, and I'll expand on a little bit about how to make this shift. I think when the book came out and people started talking about it, it's like, oh, this makes sense, but this is actually really feels harder to do in practice. And I think that's why it was so important to me. The book is filled with stories of actual young people from around the country, and their experiences, because that's one of the cool things about my work is that I've been able to work with people around the country. And in sharing their stories, like even just in my office this week, I had a student who really struggles with, concentration and focus. So I pulled off Erasing the Finish Line and I was like, hey, I want you to take about 5 minutes and I want you to read this chapter entitled Learning Takes Longer. And it's about the young man whose mom had emailed me and was the impetus for this book. And she sits there and she goes, wow, this really resonates. So, this idea of what are the things that we can do to help kids feel seen in a world that feels like if I'm not doing everything or I'm not doing everything perfectly, I'm not doing it right, and I'm going to have no options. And so that's why there's such a varied range of stories. And I think the other thing I think is really important for people to walk away from is the importance of connection and community. You have other speakers who are talking about that in depth, which I think is so important. But its relationship to executive functioning and how it was so tied into the success of so many of the students that I worked with is really fundamentally important, because we often overlook the ability of that child to connect with so many different people across differences to maintain those connections. But those are the things that actually over time allows us to find those nuggets of success in the serendipity.
That's what I think is so important about your conversation to us today. This valuing on relationships. When I think about executive functioning, I often think about the organizing, the planning, the time management, task completion, but you've really tied it in to again, I think of this as such a life skill, isn't it? What brought you to this? This was it in your work? Is that, I mean, that's a light bulb moment.
Yeah, one of the things there's 2 things. One, I ended up, when I first started working with students, I was seeing that I would ask them, "What class is the most troubling for you?" And they would name it, and then they would bring out that binder, and it was always tend to be the messiest. So I found that really interesting. And I think probably I came to it because I had my own challenges that I had figured out when I was a lot younger. So when I was working on this book, I did a lot of unique things that kind of went back into my past. I talk a little bit about my own childhood, which I don't normally do in the book. And my dad at the time was cleaning out his garage. I don't know if any of you are like this, that you keep like all the report cards from fourth or fifth grade. And I saw this report card. I have no recollection of this report card at the time. And it said, Anna really, she gets the material, but she struggles a little with organization. And people who know me now know I do have a system, but I can struggle with clutter with the best of them. But I set a timer for 20 minutes. I do a lot of the things that I talk about. So it's not like I'm coming up with these in a vacuum of like, this stuff is easy for me too. And I thought, this all makes a difference. I've seen it make a difference in so many lives, in their confidence and their ability. We've had kids who, they've totally transformed their lives. And I think all kids, all families, all schools should have access to this work.
As a parent, I could see where this could feel like, you said it so many times, and I'm so glad you did, about this parallel work.
Mhm.
Help me. I mean, someone might just say, "This is too much for me. I can't do this." Help me build some confidence, but I can't help my child with these skills.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's 2 things to think about. One, being in parallel, it's all about non-judgment and non-criticism. I'm here to support. How can I best support you? So asking those open-ended questions. But second to that, and you bring up this important point, when I started the presentation, I said, every family is different. Every
Yeah.
kid within a family is different. What works for you may not work for another person. So it may be that with one child in your family, you can do this, but with another, absolutely not. That is where you outsource to the community, to the clarifiers, to the people in your world. Find the right trusted adult who could be this person. Maybe it's an aunt, maybe it's a family friend, because our goal is that we're in community, right? Moving from this idea of the individual to community. And it just matters that they get the message, not necessarily that you or as a parent or caregiver is the messenger, especially because we know that the number one thing you want to navigate through high school is your relationship with your child, right? Like it's not worth it to be complaining about binders and planners and whether or not a child did something. Now, that being said, there are so many ways that you can be in parallel in ways that could work for you. So, one example that I'll give that I mentioned earlier today was my friend whose son's room is kind of a mess. And so she's like, "Hey, I'm going to come in. I'm going to set a timer. I'm just going to sit here on your chair and I'm going to chat with you while you go around and pick things up and put them where they belong." And that actually got him to do it. And then he felt better because, again, that idea of visual clutter is stressful for kids, is stressful for adults, but we don't know what to do about it. And this idea of a timer gamifies it. This doesn't have to be mean or horrible or challenging. It can be fun. And in 10 minutes, he gets more done than if he was trying to do it an hour on his own. And she just sat there. She's like, "I didn't do anything." But that's the
Mhm,
idea of being in parallel.
mhm. As we're closing, talk to me about the importance of modeling in this case here.
I think it's really important that everyone understand that they have their own strengths and challenges around all of these pieces, around systems, around connection, around perspectives and acceptance. We are all, like the book title, there is no finish line. So we're all working on this. And so I think it's also important for us as we're navigating this to have compassion for ourselves as well as the kids in our lives, that there isn't one moment where you say, "Ah." So I think I mentioned this, but there's two things that I often see is that one, people become very frustrated when the results don't happen overnight, right? And by overnight, I can even mean 6 months or a year. But I'm talking 2 years later, a kid's on the honor roll who had literally 50 missing assignments and mostly D's and F's. And then you're thinking about, well, once things start to work, let's take all that time structure support away because they need to figure it out on their own. And that's not the way things work. I mean, we think about adults who join fitness classes or go to, someone for extra support in one way or another. We all have people that provide time structure and support in our lives. So the other piece is once they have something that works for their kid, we want them to build the skills on their own and work in parallel. But we also want them to say, "Hey, this is the support I need to get where I want to go." And that's confidence building as well.
Here's your last question. This is a question that came in the chat. I'm enlightened. I want to sit down with my child and have a conversation about my new perspective. Help me start that conversation. What do I say?
Sure. Oh gosh. Well, there's the first place to start is if you're on upcoming winter break, say, "Hey, let's chat. What went really well last semester?" Right? What went really well? Start in the positive. What would you like to do differently this upcoming semester? And that gives them the opportunity to reflect on something they may want to improve or change or transition. And then you ask them, imagine that we're at the end of this upcoming term, whatever that is for your student, and it went really well. What would that look like? And that gives them the chance to visualize things going well, visualize a positive outcome. There are so many of us, and myself can be included in this, that we sit sometimes in the negative of like, "Oh gosh, what's our worst case scenario?" And allowing kids to identify what went well, what would they maybe like to do differently? That doesn't mean positive, that doesn't mean negative, that means different, right? So there's no judgment there. And then again, what would they feel like? And I hope if you're in the audience that you take a chance to take a look at the book because it's filled with a lot more practical strategies than we could fit in this conversation. And I hope it's useful.
Yeah, wonderful. It's an honor hosting you on every single time. I learned so much from you and hearing so many positive comments from people already. So a pleasure. And come back to us with your next excellent book. Your titles are always wonderful. Your content is wonderful, and we can't wait to have you back. And
Thank
this is
you.
where we go hug the kids. So we're going to go hug the kids.
Have a great night. Thanks so much.
So much.